Welcome to the Dayspring College Podcast. I am so glad that you are with us today. I have an extremely special guest. It's my baby mama, Susan Grimsley, my beautiful, beautiful wife. She is on the podcast with us today. Susan, how you doing, boo?
I'm doing good.
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself for those who do not know you?
So I'm Susan, Chandler's wife. That's my favorite descriptor. We are about to have a baby. Who knows, maybe by the time you hear this, but
this is true.
Hopefully a little longer than that. I have a master's in accounting, taught math for 7 years, was a cheer coach. So I've done a lot of different things, but so that's a little bit about me.
I'll brag on you for a second. You finally landed on an Enneagram number. Would you like to share that with the listeners? I know it's a little personal for you Enneagram fans, but so you know a little bit more.
So I'm an Enneagram 6, which is basically just somebody who's anxious and worries a lot, and we have a lot of plans.
That's right. Scared of all the things. So with that in mind, Susan, I'm so glad that you're on with us. I love you. So I don't get to say that to a lot of the people I interview, but I just do. So we've been studying the book of Philippians, and we are in Philippians chapter 3, and we're continuing, and we're in verse 17. We're going to read through verse 19. I'm going to read it out loud for you, and then Susan and I are going to talk through it, and then we'll end with a time where we share some marination moments sometimes to think deeply on the principles we've learned. So without further ado, chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. Brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. For many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you, even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame, with minds set on earthly things. Now, just a little context, this is written by Paul, and he is currently in prison in Rome, and he's writing this letter to those followers of Christ, as he says, brothers, in verse 17, in the city of Philippi, and this is called the letter to the Philippians, right? Makes a lot of sense. So, Susan, as we just start out with brothers or believers, you could say brothers and sisters there, join in imitating me. Tell me a little bit about the things you know about Paul, or you know based on what he's written in this letter, of things he would do that these believers should imitate.
Well, I think Paul definitely lived out his faith, and so that's a way you could imitate him. And the fact that he's in jail means that he was willing to, be in prison for what he believed. So I think one major thing I take from Paul is that he didn't really care what the world may say or do to him. He was going to live for Christ no matter what. So that's kind of the main thing I take from Paul and what I want to imitate that he did. Right.
That like he has said previously, to die is gain, because that's to be with the Lord, but to live is Christ, which means that he's going to continue to model Christianity, model what Jesus did. Practically, what are some things that maybe even like on a daily routine, Susan, you do to imitate Paul and therefore also imitate Christ?
Yeah, I think that this is some area that we probably all have ways we do it daily and ways we want to get better daily, but some suggestions maybe would be, I definitely think Paul would have spent time in prayer with the Lord because he was alone in that jail cell most of the time, other than maybe the jailers or different reasons
and
people would come.
You've seen this cell, right?
Yes, I had the opportunity years ago at this point to travel to Europe, and we got to see this cell when I graduated from high school, and it's eye-opening because it's not like what we know jail cells to look like in America today. Not that that's a place that most of us want to be either, but it felt like a hole in the floor kind of feeling, like it was just so small and dark. And to imagine that he wrote all these letters from that place, it leaves you in nothing but awe that it had to be inspired by the Holy Spirit, because most of us would have given up in a place like that and not continued to follow Christ and change the church of the future.
Yeah, Well said, and that's such a cool. I love hearing that story every time because it's so challenging. But when we think about imitation, Paul has already stated in the previous verses that he's pressing on, that he's not perfect yet, but he's striving to be like Christ, that he's considering the prize above anything else, that prize of not only salvation, but of Christ's return and his eternity spent with him. And so as he says, imitate me, I love your suggestion, Susan, about that daily prayer time and certainly scripture reading. One of my favorite things that we get to do together is worship, not only corporately with our church on Sunday. You may see us in the lobby just praising the Lord through our masks, but also like when we ride around in the car or whatever. I'm a big fan of Dan Musselman's piano music, which is pretty much all, Bethel, Hillsong, Elevation, all those folks on piano with no words. I love it. It encourages my heart. So when we think about imitating Paul, certainly those are big elements of his imitation. I think it's an interesting point to make, too, that like while Paul was writing the New Testament letters, almost all of them are extremely highly inspired by not only some of the early gospel writings, but even more inspired by the Old Testament. And so that's a great reminder that we don't call the Old Testament old because it's not relevant. It's only old because there's a new covenant in Christ. But that old covenant is still relevant to learn about. So Paul says, join in imitating me. And then he doubles down. And again, for those in Philippi who I think were probably really literal thinkers, they're like, Paul, we can't imitate you because you're not here, right? You're somewhere else. And so he says, and keep your eyes on those who walk, keyword walk, according to the example you have in us. So he went from join in imitating me, singular, to by the end of his statement, keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us, plural. And so that plural, I believe Paul is getting back to that statement he starts with, brothers, that he's saying, look, like there are many of us who are following Christ. Imitate me, that'd be great. But look out for anybody else who would also be walking this way. Susan, in your life, as you've kind of looked around in your different seasons of life, whether it was, high school, college, our early marriage, whichever season you want to pick, how did you go about looking around you and seeing those people who were walking according to the example that Paul had set and Jesus?
Yeah, I think I probably figured it out a little bit later. Maybe in high school I wasn't quite paying as much attention yet because my faith was still very young and it wasn't maybe my own as maybe in my college years it became my own. But I think I'm a people. I like to watch people, so for me, watching people is not hard. But I think just noticing those who their walk made a lot more impact than their talk. So I was looking for people who didn't have to tell me about what Jesus was doing in their life, but I could see it. Because I think we can all say the right words. If you're a believer, if you've been a believer for any time or a long time, you know the right words to say. And I think sometimes we fall into that because we're in seasons where maybe we aren't doing as well as we want to be. But to watch those around me who were living their life out worthy of being imitated without having to tell me about it. I wanted to watch women who were serving their church, who were serving their children, who were serving students. We spent a lot of time in student ministry, so watching those people give up their own personal time with their own kids or even with, just other adults to reach down and speak into students' lives, that was really impactful to me. So to watch people, just how they lived out their faith, not just talked about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so awesome to me getting to watch that, not only as my spouse, but for those of you who don't know, I've known Susan since the 6th grade, and I'd been trying to get with her the whole time, to be clear, just for the record, so it will show. But it's cool. I won, so I'm not worried about it. But yeah, to be able to watch that in others and then in your own life, it was so cool to watch where you were kind of imitating. And then I don't remember how long we had been in student ministry, but for both of us, really that switch flipped. And we said, okay, who is it that we see is starting to walk faithfully with the Lord, and how can we come alongside them and assist them? And the word would be discipleship, but
right.
But that was such a cool moment for both of us, especially through teaching and things like that. And so for those of you listening, I think it's important that we be imitating somebody like Paul's talking about, that we have somebody pouring into us, and that we also watch for people. I'm sure somebody else said it first, but Hayden Ratner said it this way, that somebody who's faithful, available, and teachable. He called him fat, right? So we want them faithful, available, and teachable. And if you see somebody like that, that may be a great opportunity to bring them up. And so Paul covers that just in verse 17. And then we move to 18, which is really interesting because the tone shifts. It's like encouraging, hey, do these things, and then it shifts to, frankly, a little bit of pain.
Right.
So let me just read 18 again. For many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. And Paul is pointing to those people who probably started with the church early in Philippi and now have fallen away. Those people who have fallen away naturally because, the parable of the sower here would be, the ground was too hard or the weeds came up and choked them out or they didn't have a good root system, whatever it may be. Those kind of people. But also, Paul had previously been talking about false teachers. Right. And so he's setting us up for that. So when you think about, Susan, that Paul would have tears because people walk as enemies of Christ, how does that resonate with you, or what does that make you think about?
Well, I really like the wording here, how it says that even with tears, because it shows that Paul's human. I think sometimes we see him as kind of higher than ourselves because of the great things he did, and just the New Testament, he has a big role in that. So sometimes maybe we don't see ourselves in the same light. But to say that he tells them this even with tears, it just shows his humanity and his sadness over it too. It kind of connects him to Philippi. Like, yes, he's not at their church with them right now or in their town, but he still can feel with them and hurt with them. And I think he's just helping remind them, like, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Like, there's going to be those who you thought were walking with you, and maybe you're finally realizing, like, they're really not. And that would be pretty hurtful. I mean, for those of you who are college students out there, that there are friends you had in high school who you're not friends with now. There's just a change in season in life, and you've probably cried tears over how their walk looks different, and you thought one thing, and that's not how it is. And I think while we could be tearful and be upset about it, I think we can also take it as a challenge to just remain prayerful for those people, that they would, one day not be an enemy of the cross of Christ again.
I love the example that Paul gives us there, that, like, when you love people, you just love them. There's no prerequisite there that I'll love you so long as you stay a follower of Jesus. Right. He only sheds tears because these are people he obviously loved and cared for. And again, if you've been following Jesus for any amount of time, there are friends, I'm sure, that you've shed tears over when they chose to not follow the Lord, or their walk rather didn't line up with their talk. And now we shift into 19. I think Paul doesn't mean to disconnect 18 to 19. I think there's sincerely people that Paul shed tears over who now walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. But when he makes that identification, walk as enemies, I think he's also trying to remind us as an astute reader to say, hey, I'm connecting this back to verse 1 and verse 2, where Paul talked about the dogs and the evildoers and the mutilators of the flesh. Those were all in references to false teachers and kind of a range of false teachers. But here's kind of Paul's synopsis on these false teachers, so kind of his summary statement on the outcome of their practice in 19. Their end is destruction. That's abundantly clear. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. So there's kind of three pieces of this, I would say, condemnation, really, that Paul's saying, hey, whatever they tell you, watch for these things. Just like you would imitate me and you would watch other people for how they act, look out for these things in these false teachers, that their God is their belly, that all they're motivated by is meeting their own personal needs, right? Whether that be financially or physically, especially we've talked about even in other elements as well. Their God is their belly. Number two, they glory in their shame. In other words, they self-promote things that are sinful.
Right.
So their end is a destruction. Their God is their belly. and they glory in their shame. Again, they're self-promoting, really evil doing, as Paul's already said. And then to me, the most condemning is number 3, that they're short-sighted.
Right.
With mindset on earthly things. So as we were talking about this earlier, I told you this was coming up. It'd be easy for us to sit here and point the finger at other people and say, man, we know so many who are guilty of this or this person or that person. But let's look in the mirror. How do you see some of these things either manifesting themselves in your own life, or especially as a 6, I imagine, kind of being anxious about your own needs. How does that impact you?
Yeah, I think anxiety would definitely impact a lot of that. But what I'm, convicted of here is like mindset on earthly things. Like currently in our season, like I said earlier, we're days away from having a baby, and that has definitely become a distraction in certain areas where, there's days whenever that's all I think about. And then there's days when I remember like, no, this is a gift from the Lord. So I think that even the good things in our life, those of us who are believers, we can turn those and setting them on the earthly things, like not focusing on the right part of it. Like it's not that everything we're doing or focusing on is bad necessarily, but why, or what is the mindset that you're focused on it with? Is it to bring glory to the Lord, or is it for your own personal gain? Because I think then you get into the whole, like their God is their belly. Well, that's all about your desires. So like, are my desires for me, or are they for expanding the kingdom of the Lord? So yeah. I think we all can look at that and just kind of reflect on, even if I'm doing great things, why am I doing them? What's my reason behind it? Absolutely.
As we kind of come to a close, is I look at this list in verse 19, their God is their belly, they glory in their shame, with their mind set on earthly things. And I juxtapose that against verse 17, join in imitating me. And the question I want to ask myself and really meditate on and marinate on is, are there things I'm modeling with my life that communicate that my God is my belly, or that I glory in shame, or that my mind is set on earthly things? Are there things in my life that I'm modeling for other people that they would go, oh, if I follow that, am I going to be more like Christ or not? Susan, what is your meditation moment from what we've talked about today?
Yeah, I think my marination moment, it definitely comes from that first verse and just remembering those who I'm imitating, but even more so, like the older I get and the more mature in my faith, am I worthy of being imitated? Could I say what Paul is saying? Join in imitating me. And I think that that's something I want to work on and think on, is that I'm constantly and consistently getting closer to Christ and being someone worthy of being imitated. And if they were more like me, they would be more like Christ. So I would love to just meditate on that, being more like Paul, that I could say, imitate me.
Wow, that is strong. Susan, thank you so much for being here. If you haven't figured it out by now, it's really hard to call her Susan all the time. For those of you who've listened the whole time, I'm going to tell you a stupid joke that I love. My nickname for Susan is Boog, which is short for booger because I picked her. Thank you so much for listening today. I pray that you have an absolutely blessed rest of your day.